When a gang broke into his home, they thought they were stealing a simple heirloom. What they didn't know was that the item they took held far more value than they realized, and that the man they underestimated was a skilled tracker with a loyal, highly trained dog by his side. Before they knew what hit them, their operations would be in shambles, key members of the network exposed, and the criminal web they built torn apart. This isn't just a story about stolen treasure. It's about one man's relentless pursuit of justice, the bond with a dog trained to protect, and how far someone will go to defend his family's legacy and secure his daughter's future against those who tried to take it away. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The morning had arrived with the kind of stillness only found in forgotten corners of Detroit. A hush that seemed to press against the window panes of Cadion Sloan's modest two-story house. The hum of the furnace whispered through the walls, the faint scent of engine grease still clinging to his skin from the day before. He shifted beneath the quilt, savoring the quiet, the fleeting moment before reality demanded his attention. From across the hall came the muffled creak of a door. Nevaeh, always up early, already in the rhythm of her morning routine, her footsteps tapped softly down the stairs, a comforting sound to a father who measured time by her habits. He smiled to himself, picturing her gathering her books, likely skimming her engineering textbook over breakfast. She had his mother's sharp mind, his stubborn resolve. The clock on the nightstand read 6:14 a.m. Cadion sighed and sat up, joints stiff from too many years chasing ghosts in deserts and jungles far from here. The watch was still on the bedside table, polished gold with a glass cover scratched from age. He reached for it, rubbing his thumb over the engraved initials. Every morning, the same ritual. Not to check the time, but to feel the weight of it. To remember that it represented more than hours passing. It was tuition, stability, and a promise fulfilled. It was his grandfather's voice echoing through his childhood. "Time's the only fortune you'll ever really own, boy." A low growl broke the silence. Cadion froze. Rocco, lying on the rug near the bedroom door, had lifted his head, ears rigid. The growl deepened to a guttural warning, primal and certain. Cadion's heart stuttered. He slid from the bed and crouched low, eyes narrowing toward the shadows pooling beneath the doorframe. The growl stopped. Rocco rose to his feet, body taut, eyes locked on the staircase beyond the door. Cadion stretched his hand toward the nightstand drawer, easing it open without a sound. His fingers hovered there, but he didn't reach for the pistol. Not yet. He stood and motioned to Rocco, who slinked toward the door, nose twitching. Then came the sound, the faintest metallic click from below, followed by the groan of wood under cautious steps. Someone was in the house. Cadion moved to the door and twisted the knob just enough to slip into the hall. His pulse remained steady as he descended the stairs, Rocco close behind. The living room stretched in shadows, the faint glow from the kitchen nightlight casting silhouettes along the walls. The scent of leather and sweat drifted through the air. Foreign, unfamiliar. Cadion inhaled deeply, grounding himself. His gaze darted toward the mantel, where the gold watch sat in plain view. The stillness of the room felt strained, stretched tight like a wire about to snap. Rocco let out a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. The atmosphere thickened with unspoken intent, a presence felt but not seen. Cadion's pulse hammered in his ears as he calculated his next move, knowing that the theft was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. The morning light crept through the thin curtains, casting pale streaks across the hardwood floor. Cadion crouched beside Rocco, heart pounding as the dog's growl deepened. The familiar warmth of the sun pressing through the window seemed incongruous with the cold tension thickening the air. Another sound, softer this time, the creak of weight shifting near the living room shelves. Cadion's gaze snapped toward the mantel, where the gold watch glimmered beneath the protective glass case. He strained to listen, holding his breath. The faintest scrape of rubber on wood followed, an unfamiliar tread. Rocco's ears twitched, his body rigid with anticipation. Kadion shifted his weight forward, scanning the shadows near the far wall. The living room was bathed in soft morning light, but the corners remained dark enough to conceal movement. The stillness stretched taut. Then, a whisper of motion. A shadow detached itself from the bookshelf. Rocco erupted into action. The dog surged forward with a ferocity that shattered the morning calm. His paws drummed across the floor, his growl turning to a sharp, guttural snarl as he crashed into the shadowed figure. The impact sent both bodies sprawling into the bookshelf. Books toppled, thudding onto the floor in a chaotic cascade. Kadion sprinted forward, senses narrowing to the unfolding struggle. Rocco had the intruder pinned beneath his weight, jaws snapping close to a black-gloved arm. The figure thrashed beneath him, legs kicking out in desperation. The intruder twisted to his side, swinging a wild fist toward Rocco's ribs. The dog yelped, but held his ground, teeth grazing fabric and flesh. Kadion reached the edge of the fight and raised his foot, slamming it into the intruder's thigh. The man grunted, but instead of retreating, he rolled with the momentum and kicked back hard, catching Kadion in the shin. Pain shot through Kadion's leg, forcing him to stagger. The intruder seized the moment, wrenching free from Rocco's grasp and scrambling toward the hallway. The dog darted after him, barking in furious pursuit. Kadion limped after them, heart racing, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The intruder disappeared around the corner toward the front entrance. Rocco gave chase, his bark sharp and relentless. But even as he moved to follow, Kadion couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hallway was too quiet, the intruder's escape too sudden, too calculated. The thud of footsteps echoed down the hallway as Kadion pushed off the wall and pursued the fleeing intruder. Rocco surged ahead, paws skittering across the hardwood as he closed the distance. The figure's black hoodie billowed slightly as he veered toward the kitchen. "Cut him off, Rocco!" Kadion barked. The dog altered his course, muscles rippling beneath his coat as he dashed around the corner, angling to intercept. Kadion's knee throbbed with every step, but he pressed forward. The intruder reached the kitchen doorway, glanced back, and hesitated for a split second when he saw Rocco closing in. But then, from the shadows of the adjacent hallway, another figure emerged. The second intruder moved with precision, dressed in black from head to toe. He crept toward the living room mantel where the gold watch sat beneath shattered glass. Kadion didn't see him. His focus was locked on the man sprinting toward the back door. The faint crunch of glass went unnoticed beneath the sound of Rocco's snarling pursuit. Kadion charged toward the kitchen, catching the first intruder just as the man turned. The two bodies collided, crashing into the wall with a dull thud. The intruder swung wildly. Kadion ducked and delivered a solid punch to the man's ribs. The man groaned but retaliated with a headbutt that caught Kadion across the brow. Pain seared through his skull. He staggered, vision swimming. Rocco leapt into the fray, launching at the man's legs and sinking his teeth into fabric and flesh. The intruder howled and struck downward, trying to dislodge the dog. Kadion blinked through the haze and saw the intruder reach for something clipped to his belt. "Rocco, back!" he shouted. The dog sprang away, just as a blade glinted in the morning light. Kadion surged forward and kicked the man's wrist, sending the knife skidding across the floor. Behind him, the second intruder reached the mantel. Gloved fingers closed around the gold watch. The faint rattle of metal barely rose above the struggle unfolding a few feet away. The fight near the kitchen intensified. The first intruder lunged, swinging his fists like sledgehammers. Kadion blocked one hit but missed the second. It slammed into his ribs, knocking the wind from his lungs. He fell to one knee. The masked man raised his foot, aiming for Kadion's chest. Rocco sprang again, crashing into the intruder and dragging him to the ground. The two figures rolled across the floor, the dog's growls blending with the man's panicked grunts. Kadion forced himself to stand. He saw the first intruder push Rocco off and scramble toward the back door. The man's arm bled from the dog's bite, leaving a trail of red streaks across the tile. The second intruder was gone. Kadian didn't register it. His focus remained on the figure stumbling through the back door. He took off after him, pain forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. The door slammed against the wall as Kadian reached it. The backyard stretched into blinding sunlight. A black SUV roared to life near the curb. The first intruder dove into the passenger seat. Tires screeched as the vehicle accelerated away. Rocco panted beside him, chest heaving. The morning air was thick with sweat, fear, and adrenaline. Kadian sagged against the doorframe, his breath uneven. Blood from a gash on his temple trickled down his face. His gaze drifted back toward the living room. The broken glass still glinted beneath the mantel. Only then did he realize the watch was gone. Kadian stood motionless, eyes fixed on the empty mantel. The shattered glass glittered beneath the morning sunlight, cruel and mocking. His breath came in shallow bursts as the reality of the loss settled into his chest like cold steel. The watch was gone, the symbol of his family's legacy, his daughter's college tuition, and his grandfather's time-hardened wisdom had been taken in broad daylight. His fists clenched at his sides as his mind raced through the sequence of the fight. Two intruders. One engaged him. The other worked quietly, methodically, stealing what they came for. Rocco whimpered beside him, ears pinned back and tongue lolling in exhaustion. Kadian knelt and rubbed the dog's head with a shaky hand. "We'll get it back," he murmured, though the words felt hollow. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, voice crisp and detached. "My house was broken into," Kadian said, forcing his voice to stay even. "Two intruders. They took something valuable." The dispatcher took his information and promised an officer would arrive shortly. Kadian hung up, shoulders sagging under the weight of frustration. Time passed in disjointed fragments. He moved mechanically, checking the locks, wiping the blood from his temple, cleaning Rocco's wounds. By the time the patrol car arrived, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by a bone-deep fatigue. Two uniformed officers, one middle-aged with graying hair, the other young and tense, stepped inside. Their eyes swept the broken room with practiced detachment. "Mr. Sloan?" the older officer asked. Kadian nodded. "Yeah, come in." He recounted the morning's events with clipped precision. The officers scribbled notes but exchanged disinterested glances as he described the masked intruders and the stolen gold watch. "So, this was a break-in for a watch?" the younger officer asked, skepticism seeping into his tone. "It wasn't just a watch," Kadian said, pulse quickening. "It was a family heirloom. Valuable." "Any idea how valuable?" the older officer asked. "Enough to pay for my daughter's tuition." The younger officer snorted softly and shook his head. "Probably just some junkie looking for quick cash. These guys break in, grab what shines, and pawn it off. Happens all the time." Anger flared in Kadian's chest. He forced it down. "Maybe," he said. "But this wasn't random. They knew what they came for." The officers left, after promising to file a report. Kadian locked the door behind them and stood in the silence of the violated living room. He knew they wouldn't find anything. The thieves were professionals. But why the watch? What did they know that he didn't? He retrieved the antique dealer's business card from the small wooden box where his grandfather had stored it years ago. The name, Elias Trenwick, collector of historical timepieces, stood embossed in worn gold lettering. The phone rang twice before an elderly voice answered. "Trenwick Antiques. How may I assist you, Mr. Trenwick? My name's Kadian Sloan. My grandfather, Caleb Sloan, did business with you years ago." He had a gold pocket watch, engraved with the initials CS. A pause followed. Then, with an audible inhale, the voice softened. "Ah, Caleb Sloan. I remember the piece. It was stolen this morning." "Stolen," Trenwick repeated, as though tasting the word. "You should come by. There are things you need to know." Kadian felt the weight of that statement settle over him. "I'll be there soon." He hung up and met Rocco's eyes. "Let's go, boy." The drive to Trenwick Antiques took them across the city to an aging storefront, squeezed between a pawn shop and a boarded-up bakery. The bell above the door jingled softly as they entered. The shop smelled of old wood and polished brass. Elias Trenwick sat behind the counter, thin and wiry, with silver-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. "You brought the dog," Trenwick said, nodding toward Rocco. "Good instincts." Kadian didn't respond. "The watch. What is it?" Trenwick opened a leather ledger and slid it across the counter. A faded photograph showed the watch in pristine condition, along with Caleb Sloane's signature. Trenwick tapped the picture. "Your grandfather was an inventor, a genius in his day. That watch isn't just valuable because it's gold." His finger traced the edge of the image. "It contains a hidden key, one that leads to a safe he built during the war. And that safe contains the plans for a technological breakthrough he never wanted to fall into the wrong hands." Kadian's pulse quickened. What kind of breakthrough? Wireless power transmission. Years ahead of its time. The plans were lost when he died. Until now. Kadian stepped back, mind racing. The watch wasn't just a family keepsake. It was a key to a forgotten legacy, with implications far beyond his family. "And someone knew about it," he said softly. "Yes," Trenwick said. "And they won't stop until they have the plans." Kadian exhaled slowly, resolve hardening in his chest. The police wouldn't help, and the thieves wouldn't give up. He would get the watch back, alone. The sun hung low in the sky, casting pale, reluctant light over Detroit's weathered streets. Kadian stood at the edge of his driveway, Rocco sitting alert beside him, ears pricked and body poised with instinctual tension. The dog's nostrils flared as he sniffed the ground near the porch steps, muscles coiled with anticipation, as though he, too, sensed the gravity of what lay ahead. Kadian knelt beside him, brushing his fingers over the faint smear of blood left behind during the fight. The memory of the intruder's scream resonated in his mind, the raw, visceral sound of fear and pain, an involuntary reaction to Rocco's relentless hold. The presence of that fear was significant. It indicated that the intruder was no hardened professional, but rather someone caught between loyalty and survival. That could be used later. He glanced toward the empty mantel visible through the living room window. The absence of the watch left a hollow space not just on the shelf but deep within his chest. He clenched his jaw, refocused, and shifted his attention back to the task at hand. "Find him," Kadian commanded, voice low, steady. Rocco lowered his head, nose pressed to the ground, and began to move. His steps were deliberate, each inhale sharp and purposeful, as he followed the invisible trail of human scent. Kadian followed closely, heart racing with the weight of this unorthodox pursuit. The police had dismissed him, left him to shoulder this burden alone. Fine. He had been trained for less certain paths than this. The trail led them past cracked sidewalks and through narrow alleyways where the concrete still held faint traces of adrenaline-laced sweat and blood. Every few feet, Rocco paused, recalibrated, then pressed on, unrelenting in his work. Kadian's pulse thrummed with each turn, each step drawing them further from familiar streets into the forgotten veins of the city. 2 blocks down, Rocco stopped abruptly, his posture rigid. His nose hovered just above an oil-slicked patch of pavement. Kadian crouched beside him, placing a hand on the dog's back to steady his own breathing. The asphalt bore the distinct curving grooves of tires that had accelerated too fast, likely the SUV that had carried the intruders and the stolen watch away. The faint metallic tang of heated brake fluid lingered in the morning air. "Good," Kadian muttered, scanning the surroundings. The scent trail veered toward a narrow alley flanked by decaying brick walls, adorned with graffiti, words of forgotten warnings and unclaimed territory. Rocco moved forward, his steps light but purposeful, leading them into the shadowed corridor. The alley tightened as they advanced, the stale air thick with the odors of rotting garbage and motor oil. Near the midpoint, Rocco halted, nose pressing against a discarded sweatshirt, tangled around a rusted metal pipe. The fabric was damp and stained with sweat, the acrid scent of fear clinging to it like an invisible residue. Kadian lifted the sweatshirt, turning it over with measured care. The material was unremarkable except for a faint, stitched insignia along the hem. A stylized S, bisected by a jagged line, resembling a fractured circle. The symbol triggered an itch of recognition, something half-remembered from years past, though its meaning eluded him. Rocco growled softly, his gaze fixed on the far end of the alley. Kadian followed the dog's line of sight to a door, old, metal, and slightly ajar, embedded in the brick wall. The scuff marks at the threshold told a clear story. Multiple entries, frequent use. He approached the door, motioning for Rocco to stay close. The dog obeyed, muscles tense, eyes unblinking. Kadian pressed his ear against the metal surface and heard it. Faint, labored breathing, punctuated by the occasional creak of shifting weight. Without a word, Kadian pushed the door inward. The dim room beyond reeked of stale sweat and oil, the air thick with the oppressive weight of hidden activity. Metal shelves lined the walls, stacked with crates of old equipment. In the center stood a table covered in maps, tools, and a few crumpled papers. Rocco entered ahead of him, sniffing the floor in tight, controlled circles. A rustle came from the far side of the table. Kadian pivoted, eyes locking on a figure crouched in the shadows. The person sprang up and bolted toward the rear exit, but Rocco lunged and intercepted them with a snarl. The intruder cried out and fell, arms flailing as they tried to fend off the dog's relentless grip. Kadian crossed the room in seconds, grabbing the intruder by the collar and yanking them upright. The figure was young, late teens or early 20s, face pale beneath a black ski mask. Kadian tore the mask away, revealing a gaunt face with terrified eyes. As the boy twisted, Kadian's eyes caught a faint smear of dried blood on the cuff of his jacket, matching the streak Rocco's bite had left in the fight earlier that morning. The cut was deep, angry, and unmistakably fresh. "That was you in my house," Kadian said, voice sharp and unyielding. The boy's pupils contracted with the telltale recognition of being cornered. His breathing quickened as his eyes darted toward the door. "Don't!" Kadian warned, tightening his grip. "The watch." "Why did you take it?" The boy squeezed his eyes shut, as though bracing against the weight of the truth. I didn't have a choice," he stammered. "Who hired you?" The boy's gaze darted to the floor. "Malric Vexel," he whispered. The name struck Kadian with the force of a hammer to the chest. The Vexel family name had surfaced in old conversations with his grandfather, tales of a rival inventor obsessed with discrediting Caleb Sloan's work. Malric Vexel was the last living remnant of that rivalry. "Why does Vexel want the watch?" Kadian asked, voice low and dangerous. The boy's lips trembled. "He said it's his. Said your grandfather stole it, and he needs the key to finish what was started." The world shifted slightly beneath Kadian's feet. The watch wasn't just a relic. It was a key, not to a vault of gold, but to something far more dangerous. "Where is Vexel?" Kadian asked, tone cold as steel. The boy's throat bobbed with a swallow. "The old foundry, near the river. That's where we take everything we steal for him." Kadian released him with a rough shove. The boy collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Rocco stood beside his master, eyes locked on the intruder without a shred of mercy. Kadian turned toward the table and scanned the maps. One blueprint in particular stood out, a schematic of the old Wexler steel foundry. Lines annotated with fresh markings indicating security positions and access routes. The foundry was more than just a drop point. It was a hub. "Come on, Rocco," Kadian said, as he folded the blueprint and stuffed it into his jacket. "We're going to the river." The dog fell in beside him as they stepped out into the sunlight. The morning no longer bright, but cast in the heavy shadow of what lay ahead. The wind carried the metallic tang of rust and rain as Kadian crouched beside a crumbling concrete barrier, his eyes locked on the rust-streaked walls of the Wexler steel foundry. The building loomed like a forgotten relic from a time when industry had thrived here, now reduced to corroded beams and empty windows that gaped like hollow eyes. The map taken from the hideout confirmed this was the drop site where the watch had been delivered, and judging by the faint hum of activity emanating from within, Someone was still here. Rocco lay beside him, pressed low to the ground, his nostrils flaring as he absorbed the scents wafting from the foundry. His ears twitched, and his eyes remained fixed on the half-open side door, where a sliver of pale light spilled onto the rain-slicked gravel. Kadian inhaled slowly, mind sharpening to the task ahead. The thieves had come this far for a reason. The watch was the key, but the blueprint suggested something larger, a broader operation involving more than a simple heirloom. The name Malric Vexel echoed in his mind, an unfamiliar adversary tied inexplicably to his grandfather's invention. He tapped Rocco's flank lightly. "We go quiet. Let's see what we're dealing with." Rocco responded with a low huff and slinked forward, gliding through the shadows with practiced precision. Kadian followed, footsteps soundless on the wet gravel. They reached the side door and paused. Rocco's nose hovered near the ground before lifting toward the narrow gap beneath the door. His body tensed. Voices murmured inside, faint but distinct through the thin steel. "Langston didn't say it was gonna be this big. Langston works for Vexel. Doesn't matter what we think." Kadian froze. The name Langston was unfamiliar, but the mention of Vexel sent a jolt of recognition through him. He motioned for Rocco to stay back, and then eased the door open just enough to peer inside. The room beyond was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb dangling from a frayed cord. Two men stood near a metal table cluttered with equipment. On the table lay a heavy black duffel bag, partially unzipped. Inside, Kadian spotted the distinct glint of brass, the stolen gold watch. The men continued talking, oblivious to the danger crouched beyond the door. "Meetings at midnight. Vexel wants the key in his hands before then." The taller of the two men reached into the bag and lifted the watch, turning it under the light. His fingers traced the engraved initials, and his mouth curled into a sneer. "All this for this tiny piece of junk? Can't believe people killed each other over this thing." "Not just people," the shorter man said, voice low. "Families. This watch is bigger than you know." Kadian's patience snapped. He pushed the door open with controlled force and surged inside, Rocco at his side. "Drop it!" he barked. The taller man flinched and fumbled the watch. It clattered to the table. His hand darted toward his waistband, but Kadian was faster. He closed the distance and drove his fist into the man's ribs. The impact forced a grunt from the intruder, who doubled over in pain. Kadian followed with a sharp elbow to the jaw, sending the man sprawling against the concrete wall. The second man scrambled toward the far end of the room, pulling a compact pistol from his jacket. Rocco lunged before the weapon cleared the holster. The dog's teeth clamped down on the man's wrist with crushing force. The pistol fired once, the shot cracking like a whip, embedding itself in the ceiling. Kadian turned toward the commotion as Rocco wrestled the gunman to the floor. The man screamed, blood running down his arm as the dog maintained its grip. "Hold him, Rocco," Kadian commanded. He crossed to the table and snatched up the watch. The brass casing felt cool and familiar in his palm, the weight reassuring. "Who sent you?" he asked the man pinned beneath Rocco. The gunman groaned, eyes wide and desperate. "We don't know names. Just the orders came from Langston. We just move what we're told." Kadian knelt beside him, gripping the man's wounded wrist. "Why does Vexel want the watch?" The man's lips trembled, breath hitching in shallow gasps. He said it's the key to the vault. The plans, your grandfather's plans." Before Kadian could ask more, Rocco's ears flattened, and the dog growled, a low, guttural warning directed toward the window. Kadian followed Rocco's gaze and froze. Through the grimy window pane, barely visible against the gray morning sky, a silhouette shifted on the rooftop of the neighboring building. The figure moved with deliberate slowness, adjusting something on their shoulder. A sniper. "Down!" Kadian roared, hurling himself toward Rocco. The bullet shattered the window with a sharp crack. Glass exploded across the room. Kadian hit the floor, shielding Rocco beneath him. The man on the ground jerked as the bullet struck him square in the temple. His body went still instantly, eyes glassing over in shock. The taller man, still dazed, scrambled for the door. Another shot rang out. The bullet caught him mid-stride, spinning him sideways before he collapsed against the wall. Lifeless, silence settled in the room, broken only by the rasp of Kadion's breath and the faint ping of glass shards settling on the floor. He dared a glance toward the window. The rooftop across the street was empty. The sniper was gone. Rocco whined softly beneath his arm. Kadion slowly sat up, cradling the watch in his hand. Blood from the dead men's wounds spread across the concrete, forming irregular crimson patterns beneath the table. Whoever Malric Vexel was, he didn't just send thieves to retrieve the watch. He sent executioners to clean up the trail. Kadion exhaled slowly, eyes hardening. This wasn't just about the watch anymore. The metallic tang of blood lingered in the air as Kadion stood amid the shattered glass and lifeless bodies of the foundry office. His hand gripped the gold watch with a force that turned his knuckles white, the smooth brass surface cool against his palm, despite the heat burning in his chest. Rocco sat beside him, ears pinned back, eyes fixed on the window where the sniper had vanished moments before. The men they had fought were dead, executed before they could divulge more details. Yet their words still clung to Kadion's memory, like the stench of gunpowder and fear. Langston works for Vexel, the key to the vault, the plans your grandfather made. And on the blood-streaked table, partially obscured beneath a map, lay something even more unsettling, a torn receipt from a storage facility on the east side of the city. The handwritten name scrawled across the bottom froze Kadion in place. Darnell Sloan. Kadion's stomach tightened. Daz. His half-brother. The name stirred memories he'd buried years ago. Long nights filled with tension as their father tried to bridge the chasm between his sons. Kadion's mother had been patient but wary of the boy from his father's other relationship. Daz had always carried a chip on his shoulder, resenting the attention Caleb Sloan had given to Kadion, the legitimate heir to the Sloan legacy. The resentment had grown like a stubborn weed, until Daz eventually cut ties. But now his name was scrawled on a receipt connected to a violent break-in and the theft of the watch. He picked up the receipt and turned it over. The address: Ironclad Storage, Unit 47C. He pocketed the paper, then knelt beside Rocco, who was still sniffing the floor near one of the dead intruders. "You've got the scent?" Kadion asked softly. Rocco wagged his tail once, nose pressed against a smear of dried blood on the concrete. "Good. Let's follow it." The industrial district on Detroit's east side mirrored the city's decay. Rows of rusted warehouses and silent smokestacks standing like headstones for a bygone era. Kadion parked a block from the storage facility and studied the chain-link fence that surrounded the property. The padlock on the gate was broken, the links forced apart to create a narrow gap. Rocco sniffed the air and whined softly. Kadion grabbed the crowbar from under his seat, tucked the watch into his jacket pocket, and signaled Rocco to move. They passed through the fence and followed the dog's lead toward the row of storage units. Unit 47C stood at the far end. The metal door was slightly ajar. Kadion pressed his back against the cold steel of the neighboring unit and listened. Faint shuffling sounds came from inside, accompanied by the muted scrape of cardboard against concrete. He exhaled slowly, crouched low, and motioned for Rocco to stay back. The door creaked as he nudged it open with the crowbar. Inside, surrounded by half-opened boxes and papers strewn across the floor, stood a man with sandy blonde hair and a wiry build. His back was turned as he rifled through a metal filing cabinet. Kadion recognized him immediately. "Daz!" The man froze, fingers still gripping the cabinet handle. Slowly, he turned. His pale blue eyes widened at the sight of Kadion standing in the doorway, crowbar in hand, with Rocco growling at his side. "Cade, what are you doing here?" Daz's voice wavered. "I should be asking you that," Kadion said, stepping further into the unit. He gestured toward the papers scattered across the floor. Some were blueprints bearing their grandfather's name. Others showed schematics Kadion didn't recognize. You're working with them. With Vexel, Daz's jaw tightened. It's not what you think. Really? Because 2 guys died this morning in a foundry after stealing my watch. Our grandfather's watch. And their orders came from Vexel. Your name's on the damn receipt, Daz. Daz stepped back, knocking over a box with his heel. The papers fluttered like wounded birds across the concrete. I didn't know it would go this far, Daz said, voice breaking. I thought they just wanted the watch. Langston said it was Vexel's by right, that Grandpa stole the design and ruined their family. I didn't know about the sniper or the bodies. Kadion advanced slowly, eyes locked on his brothers. So you gave them access to my house? Daz's gaze fell to the floor. Yeah, he whispered. They told me you were sitting on a fortune. Said the watch was just a relic hiding the key to it. And I needed the money, man. To pay off your gambling debts? Kadion asked, voice cold. Daz flinched. So you opened the door for them, Kadion said, gripping the crowbar so tightly his knuckles ached. You let them into my home. Into Neve's life. All for a payout? It wasn't supposed to go like this, Daz blurted. I didn't know they'd torch the foundry or shoot people. I just thought I could finally get out from under your shadow. Kadion exhaled slowly, the pieces falling into place with grim clarity. The resentment Daz had carried for decades had been weaponized by Vexel's people. They had manipulated that bitterness, turning him into their pawn. Malric Vexel, Kadion said, more to himself than to his brother. Why is he so obsessed with my grandfather's work? Daz hesitated, licking his lips as his eyes darted toward the exit. Don't, Kadion said, stepping closer. You try to run. I'll let Rocco finish what he started. Rocco growled on cue, teeth bared in a feral snarl. Daz paled. Vexel's father, Daz said quickly. He worked with Grandpa Caleb during the war. They developed the prototype for wireless energy transmission together. But when it came time to patent it, Grandpa did it alone. Vexel claims the design was his family's. He's been after it ever since. Kadion's mind whirred, piecing together the vendetta that spanned decades. His grandfather had once spoken of an engineer named Victor Vexel, a brilliant man consumed by his obsession with power and recognition. Caleb Sloan had patented the design first, but Victor Vexel had spent years trying to dispute the claim. Now his son, Malric, had picked up the cause. And now Vexel has the watch, Kadion said. The key to the plans. Daz's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Yeah, that's why Langston wanted it so bad. They need it to access the vault where the prototype schematics are locked away. Where? Kadion demanded. Daz hesitated. Kadion stepped closer, raising the crowbar slightly. Don't make me ask again. Daz's resolve broke. There's an auction, midnight, at the old Rexford Industrial Complex. Vexel's selling the plans to some big foreign buyer. That's why they needed the watch, to prove authenticity and unlock the vault. The words hit Kadion like a hammer to the chest. The theft hadn't been about money. It had been a precision move to deliver advanced technology to the highest bidder. His grandfather's life's work, something designed to benefit society, was being weaponized as a commodity. You're coming with me, Kadion said, voice cold and final. What? Daz's eyes widened. No way, man. Vexel'll kill me if he finds out I talked. Yeah? Kadion grabbed his brother's collar and hauled him forward. I'm not much safer. You're going to help me stop that auction, or I'll leave you here for Vexel to find. Daz opened his mouth to protest, but the truth of his situation weighed heavier than his excuses. Fine, he rasped. Good. Kadion released him and turned to Rocco. Let's go. As they stepped outside, the air hung thick with impending rain. The clock on Kadion's phone read 6:47 p.m. 5 hours remained before the auction. Time was running out. Just like his grandfather had warned. The night air thickened with humidity as Kadion sat behind the wheel of his truck, eyes fixed on the abandoned Rexford Industrial Complex. The old steelworks loomed like a sleeping giant against the hazy Detroit skyline. Its skeletal framework, lit by sporadic bursts of yellow from floodlights rigged across the property. Rain threatened overhead, the clouds swollen and restless, mirroring the pressure coiling in Kadion's chest. Beside him, Daz fidgeted with the hem of his hoodie, his leg bouncing nervously. Rocco, stretched out in the back seat, let out a low, disapproving growl every time Daz shifted too abruptly. "Relax," Kadion said, gripping the steering wheel without taking his eyes off the complex. "You're making the dog nervous." Daz huffed, knuckles whitening as he wrung his hands together. "You think I'm not nervous? These guys, they don't play around, Cade. Vexel's got mercenaries, not just some street-level thugs. You should have thought about that before you sold me out." The silence that followed was heavy and unforgiving. The night air pressed against Kadion's skin like a suffocating weight, thick with the metallic tang of rust and distant rain. He crouched beside his truck, eyes fixed on the floodlit silhouette of the Rexford Industrial Complex. The old steelworks loomed like a forgotten fortress, its corroded beams stretching skyward, clawing at the low, swollen clouds. The pale glow of the floodlights revealed faint movement near the entrance, shadows shifting with sharp, practiced precision. Beside him, Daz knelt, his breaths shallow and irregular, sweat glistening along his brow. He wiped his palms repeatedly against his jeans, his eyes locked on the distant gate. Between them, Rocco crouched low, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the thick night air. His ears twitched, tracking the faint mechanical sounds emanating from inside the compound. "You're vibrating," Kadion said, adjusting the crowbar beneath his jacket. His voice remained calm, steady, but his pulse drummed a warning rhythm beneath the surface. Daz rubbed his hands together, his foot tapping uncontrollably against the gravel. "That's because we're about to walk into a high-stakes black market auction being run by a corporate psychopath who doesn't leave loose ends," he hissed. "You want me to be calm? Try explaining again why this insane plan is supposed to work." "Because Langston doesn't know we're here," Kadion replied, scanning the perimeter. "He thinks tonight's about making a sale. But this isn't just a business deal for Vexel. It's a legacy play. He won't let those plans leave this facility in anyone else's hands. And how does that help us? Simple. We disrupt the auction, corrupt the data transfer, and cut off their access to the vault before Vexel shows his hand. Without the data, the sale becomes worthless. That buys us time to take back the watch and figure out his next move." Daz let out a humorless laugh and shook his head. "Yeah, okay. We just sabotage a multi-million-dollar deal in front of a bunch of well-armed, trigger-happy mercs. Sounds like a walk in the park." Kadion met his brother's gaze. "You opened the door for these people. Now you help me close it." Daz swallowed hard, gave a reluctant nod, then glanced toward the entrance. Security pattern looks tight. 2-man patrols. They cross paths every 30 seconds, then regroup at the gate. After the next pass, we move. Good. We cut left, stay close to the wall, and head straight for the server hub near the back of the foundry. That's where the vault interface is routed. Daz's eyes flicked to Rocco. "And him?" "Rocco stays on my flank until I give the signal. He knows the game." The dog shifted at the mention of his name, muscles coiling beneath his fur as though sensing the weight of the moment. The 2 guards at the gate passed each other, exchanging brief nods. "Now," Kadion said. They moved swiftly, keeping to the shadows that pooled along the fence line. Kadion led the way, crouching low, his steps deliberate and soundless. Daz followed, clenching his jaw to steady his breathing. Rocco moved beside Kadion, perfectly synchronized with his handler's pace. The gate was reinforced with steel bars and secured by an electronic lockbox mounted to the side. Kadion knelt beside it, inspecting the device. "Military-grade access," he muttered. "They're getting smarter." "Yeah, great. Now what?" Daz whispered. Kadion retrieved a thin metal tool from his pocket and inserted it into the lock's maintenance port. He twisted it clockwise, then gave the device a sharp tap. The lock buzzed faintly, and the gate shifted with a metallic groan. Daz's eyes widened. How the old supply depots overseas used the same Chinese-made lock systems. Kadion said as he slipped through the gate. Outdated firmware. Never patched. Right, Daz muttered, slipping after him. Good to know. The foundry's interior was a vast, industrial cathedral of rusted steel beams and cracked concrete. Overhead, floodlights bathed the space in sterile white light, casting sharp shadows across the makeshift auction floor. The air hummed with low conversations as buyers studied the projected blueprint that dominated the far wall. A schematic of Caleb Sloan's wireless energy transmitter, complete with annotations and technical overlays. The gold watch, gleaming beneath the glass display case, rested on a raised platform at the center of the room. A thin cable snaked from the display to the vault's interface at the back wall. The vault itself, a reinforced steel monolith, stood like a sentinel guarding the priceless information within. Kadion's stomach tightened at the sight of his grandfather's work, reduced to a mere commodity. Daz tapped his shoulder. Langston, stage left. Kadion followed his gaze to the stage, where Victor Langston stood at a sleek podium, addressing the audience with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He wore a crisp black suit and a wireless earpiece, his hand gesturing toward the display as he spoke. The culmination of decades of innovation, Langston said, voice smooth and magnetic. Caleb Sloan laid the foundation for wireless power transmission, but his vision was suppressed, buried beneath the bureaucracy of obsolete energy markets. Now, tonight, we reclaim that vision, the audience murmured with quiet approval. Langston turned toward the technician standing beside the vault. Authenticate the device. The technician opened the glass case, removed the gold watch, and placed it into the scanner atop the vault interface. The machine whirred softly. Gears engaged. Lights blinked along the side panel as the system confirmed the watch's biometric signature. A faint click resonated across the floor. The vault door released with a hiss and swung open, revealing neatly stacked blueprints, data drives, and the hard drive that contained the original schematics. Langston spread his arms. Authentication complete. The vault is open. Bidding begins at 5 million. Kadion exhaled slowly. That's our window, he whispered to Daz. The cables leading to the server hub run along the east side wall. Let's move. They stayed low, weaving through the crowd as the bidding escalated. 10 million. 12. 15. The air thickened with anticipation as the bidder's hunger became palpable. The server hub was concealed beneath a metal console near the vault. Kadion crouched beside it, examining the thick, insulated cables running from the vault's base to the network hardware. Daz knelt beside him. How long? Less than a minute if you keep quiet. Kadion retrieved his wire cutters and pressed them against the thickest cable, the primary data conduit linking the vault to the external servers. The blade bit through the insulation with a sharp snap. The overhead display flickered. Langston faltered mid-sentence, glancing toward the vault interface. The technician scrambled to the control panel, confusion etched across his face. Kadion moved to the next cable, severing it with another precise snip. The display went dark. The vault interface emitted a high-pitched error tone. Langston's eyes narrowed. What in the world? He pressed a finger to his earpiece. Command? What's going on with the data feed? The technician shook his head. Someone's cut the primary link. The transfer's dead. Langston's expression darkened. Find the source. The auction floor shifted from poised anticipation to tense uncertainty. Daz tugged on Kadion's sleeve. Time to go, he whispered. Kadion gave Rocco a subtle hand signal. The dog backed away from the server hub and slipped into the shadows along the perimeter. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed across the floor. Too late, Kadion muttered. Langston's guards appeared from the side corridor, rifles raised. There! One of them shouted, pointing directly at Kadion and Daz. Run! Kadion ordered. They bolted toward the far exit. The guards opened fire, bullets whining against the steel beams. The crowd scattered in panic, chairs overturning and glass shattering as chaos erupted across the floor. Langston drew his pistol and advanced toward the vault. Lock it down, he barked into his radio. Don't let them near the vault! Kadion reached the corner of the room and skidded behind a steel pillar. Rocco appeared beside him, chest heaving with adrenaline. Daz ducked low, gasping. They're everywhere! No, Kadion said, scanning the room. They're focused on us. The vault's still exposed. A figure stepped onto the stage. Malric Vexel. The room seemed to still as he entered. His posture was unhurried, his eyes gleaming with cold amusement. Kadion Sloan, Vexel said, voice carrying through the confusion. You've been quite the nuisance. Kadion's muscles tensed, his grip tightening around the crowbar. Rocco crouched beside him, hackles raised, his amber eyes locked on Vexel with animal instinct. Stay close, Kadion said to the dog, his voice low and steady. He surged from cover, moving in unison with Rocco, both predator and soldier advancing across the chaos-strewn floor. Vexel smiled and raised the watch, turning it between his fingers. His gaze flicked from Kadion to the dog, amusement curling at the edges of his lips. Come and get it, he taunted. The foundry's atmosphere thickened with smoke and tension as Kadion squared his shoulders, eyes locked on Malric Vexel standing on the stage. The polished brass watch dangled from Vexel's fingers, glinting beneath the emergency lights as if mocking Kadion's desperation. Vexel's eyes met his across the chaos. The faint smile never left his face. All teams, Vexel said into his comm device, voice calm and measured. Secure the vault and prepare the package for transport. I'm leaving with the watch. Kill anyone who interferes. The command sliced through the confusion like a cold wind. The mercenaries responded instantly, pivoting in near-perfect synchronization. Kadion scanned the shifting battlefield. Two-man teams fanned out toward the vault, one unit moving to secure the main floor, while others converged toward the catwalks. Their approach was methodical, designed to isolate threats and neutralize them with minimal risk. Rocco, track left, Kadion ordered, pointing toward the west side of the room. Force them wide, the dog reacted immediately, darting into the shadows, his paws silent against the concrete. Kadion shifted his weight and sprinted toward the nearest cover as the first shots cracked through the air. Bullets peppered the steel pillar behind him, sending shards of rusted metal into his shoulder. The sting barely registered as adrenaline surged through his veins. He ducked behind a rusted generator and took a quick inventory of his surroundings. The mercenaries had split into 3 groups, one securing the vault, one advancing on his position, and the third maintaining overwatch from the catwalks. The group heading toward him moved in a staggered formation, 3 abreast, weapons raised. The lead soldier signaled with 2 fingers, and the man on the right broke off to flank Kadion's position. Military training, disciplined, predictable. He reached into his jacket and retrieved the small multi-tool he always carried, flipping the blade into position. His eyes locked on the flanker's silhouette as the man crept along the far side of the generator. Kadion shifted slightly, letting his shadow stretch into the open. The flanker took the bait and lunged forward, rifle ready. Kadion exploded from cover. He intercepted the mercenary mid-step, grabbing the barrel of the rifle with his left hand while driving the multi-tool blade upward into the soft tissue beneath the man's arm. The mercenary gasped, body seizing as the knife severed the brachial artery. Kadion twisted the weapon free and let the man collapse, unconscious from blood loss within seconds. The other 2 mercenaries reacted instantly. One opened fire, while the other sprinted to reposition. Kadion ducked low and sprinted toward the nearest workbench. Bullets shredded the plywood surface behind him, wood splinters and metal fragments biting into his legs. He vaulted over the bench and rolled into a crouch, heart hammering in his chest. Across the room, the second team reached the vault. A technician attached a portable drive to the server hub, attempting to override the damage Kadion and Daz had inflicted earlier. The mercenary on the catwalk called out coordinates through his radio. Target near the south generator. Adjust fire. Kadion inhaled slowly, forcing himself to think through the chaos. The mercenaries were fixated on him, but Rocco was still free. He tapped his thigh twice, signaling the dog. The shadows shifted across the floor. Rocco appeared behind the trio, guarding the vault, teeth bared in predatory focus. "Rocco!" Kadion shouted. "Take down!" The Belgian Malinois launched forward with terrifying speed. The nearest mercenary turned just as Rocco collided with his legs, toppling him with brute force. The dog's jaws locked around the man's forearm, crushing bone with a sickening crack. The second guard turned his rifle toward the dog. Kadion didn't hesitate. He rose from cover, hurled the multi-tool, and struck the guard's exposed throat with pinpoint accuracy. The man dropped his weapon, clutching his throat as he collapsed beside his partner. Rocco released his grip and immediately scanned for the next target, but the technician had already succeeded. The portable drive emitted a sharp, confirming beep as it completed the override. "The data's extracted!" the technician shouted into his radio. "Transferring to the primary drive." Kadion's stomach dropped. The data was no longer the target. They were taking the physical hard drive. He scanned the floor, searching for Vexel. The man was gone. His gaze shifted toward the far end of the foundry. The maintenance stairwell leading to the loading bay stood open. A tall, suited figure climbed the steps, the gold watch still glinting in his hand. "Rocco! With me!" Kadion barked. They sprinted across the floor, weaving through the debris. The remaining mercenaries adjusted their aim and fired, but Kadion kept moving, adrenaline dulling the pain from the grazing shots that ripped across his arms and legs. The stairs vibrated beneath his feet as he ascended two at a time, Rocco close behind. The upper landing opened into a narrow corridor lined with rusted steel beams. Ahead, Vexel moved with the unhurried grace of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. He reached a reinforced door at the end of the hall and tapped a code into the keypad. The lock released with a hollow click. "Vexel!" Kadion shouted, voice echoing along the corridor. Vexel paused with his hand on the door. Slowly, he turned to face them. "You're tenacious," Vexel said, his expression calm despite the pulse of exertion along his temple. "I'll give you that." He raised the watch slightly. "All of this for a family heirloom? Or is it guilt that drives you?" Kadion steadied his breath, the crowbar slick with sweat in his hand. Rocco stood at his side, body taut and ready. "You're not leaving with that watch," Kadion said. Vexel's smile sharpened. "Oh, I am. But by all means, try to stop me." He stepped through the doorway and slammed the door shut. A deep mechanical whir followed as metal bolts locked into place. Kadion surged forward and struck the door with the crowbar. The steel barely dented beneath the force. He stepped back, assessing the corridor. To his right, a ventilation duct ran along the ceiling, wide enough for Rocco but not for him. On the left, the window overlooking the loading bay was partially open. Vexel was heading for the loading dock. Kadion moved to the window and looked down. The SUVs were already running, their engines purring beneath the distant hum of sirens approaching from the city streets. Mercenaries loaded the portable drive into the rear of the lead vehicle, while Vexel descended the staircase on the far side. "Rocco," Kadion said, pointing to the duct. "Go, track, and engage." The dog leaped onto the crates stacked beneath the vent, scrambled into the duct, and vanished into the shadows. Kadion turned back to the window. The drop was at least 20 feet. He exhaled, adjusted his grip on the crowbar, and jumped. The air rushed past him, the fractured light from the floodlights blurring as he fell. His feet hit the roof of the nearest SUV with a metallic crash. The vehicle rocked beneath the impact. The mercenaries spun toward him. Kadion lunged forward. The metallic roof of the SUV buckled beneath Kadion's landing, the force of the impact reverberating through his legs. He bent his knees to absorb the shock, landing low and balanced, crowbar gripped tightly in his right hand. The cold, humid night air filled his lungs, carrying the acrid tang of gasoline and cordite. The mercenaries surrounding the vehicle reacted with sharp efficiency. No hesitation. No wasted movements. They immediately raised their rifles, spreading into a semicircle to cut off any possible escape. Their laser sights flickered red across Kadion's chest like a constellation of impending death. Kadion crouched, eyes sweeping the positions of the 5 men. Their tactical movements were textbook: staggered formation, interlocking fire zones, and silent communication through hand signals. Professionals! But professionals had patterns, and patterns could be broken. "Rocco!" Kadion barked. "Engage right flank!" The duct above the loading bay vented a sharp metallic clang. Rocco exploded from the vent with terrifying speed, his muscular body propelling him through the opening like a projectile. The dog hit the nearest mercenary from above, jaws clamping down on the man's shoulder. The impact drove the man to the pavement with a bone-crunching thud. The mercenaries hesitated, momentarily disoriented by the sudden canine assault. Kadion seized the opportunity. He sprang from the SUV, landing just inside the circle. His crowbar lashed out in a blur, catching the nearest mercenary's rifle barrel. He twisted the weapon downward and smashed the blunt end into the man's face. Cartilage snapped. Blood sprayed across the concrete. The mercenary crumpled, unconscious, before he hit the ground. The next soldier swung his rifle like a club. Kadion ducked beneath the arc and surged forward. His left hand clamped around the man's wrist, forcing the barrel upward as the gun discharged into the night sky. With a brutal pivot, Kadion drove his knee into the man's ribs, feeling the crack of fractured bone beneath his strike. The mercenary collapsed, choking on a ragged gasp. "Rocco! Shift!" Kadion shouted. The dog released his hold and darted toward the next attacker. The mercenary raised his weapon, finger tightening on the trigger. Rocco lunged, jaws snapping around the man's calf. The soldier shrieked as the dog wrenched him off balance, pulling him to the ground. Kadion didn't stop. He turned toward the last standing mercenary, the leader of the unit. The man recognized the shift in dynamics immediately and transitioned to a sidearm, bringing the pistol to bear with mechanical precision. Kadion sprinted toward him. The shot cracked through the air, the muzzle flash painting the night in orange light. Kadion twisted mid-stride. The bullet grazed his side, slicing through fabric and flesh. Pain erupted along his ribs, hot and sharp. He ignored it. Pain was a distraction. Survival demanded action. He dropped the crowbar as he closed the distance. The mercenary fired again. Kadion deflected the man's wrist with his forearm. The shot went wide, striking the SUV behind them. Before the man could recover, Kadion drove his forehead into the bridge of the mercenary's nose. The crunch of breaking bone vibrated through his skull. The man's grip slackened. Kadion ripped the pistol from his grasp and fired a single controlled shot into his thigh. The mercenary collapsed, howling in agony. Breathing hard, Kadion scanned the area. The ground was littered with groaning bodies and scattered weapons. Rocco stood alert beside the last downed man, chest heaving, muzzle slick with blood. But Vexel was nowhere to be seen. Kadion's gaze shot toward the far end of the loading dock. The back gate was ajar, swinging slightly from a hastily disengaged locking mechanism. Tire tracks streaked across the gravel beyond it. "He's running," Kadion muttered. He bent down, wiped his bloody hands on the nearest mercenary's vest, and retrieved his crowbar. "Rocco, track!" Kadion commanded. The dog inhaled deeply, nostrils flaring as he locked onto Vexel's scent. With a sharp bark, Rocco took off through the gate. Kadion followed, legs burning from exertion, side throbbing with every stride. The chase had begun. The gravel crunched beneath their feet as they crossed the empty lot. Rocco led the way. His instincts dialed into the hunt. Kadion trailed close, his mind running through the tactical puzzle ahead. Vexel was calculating, not impulsive. He wouldn't be fleeing aimlessly. He'd have an extraction plan. The SUVs were compromised, but that didn't mean Vexel was without options. Ahead, a chain-link fence marked the edge of the property. The metal swayed slightly, the padlock cut clean through. "He's heading toward the rail yard," Kadion realized aloud. The old Detroit South rail yard lay beyond the fence, abandoned tracks stretching into the industrial outskirts. It was isolated, unmonitored, and perfect for an exfiltration. Rocco squeezed through the gap in the fence. Kadion vaulted over it, landing with a grunt as pain flared along his ribs. He forced himself upright and pressed on. The rail yard was dimly lit by a handful of flickering streetlights. Rusted freight cars lined the tracks like forgotten relics. Rocco paused, nose low to the ground, then sprinted toward a line of stacked shipping containers near the loading platform. Kadion caught a glimpse of movement ahead. A black SUV idled beside the platform, its headlights off. The trunk was open. Two men stood beside it, rifles slung over their shoulders, scanning the perimeter. Vexel stood at the rear of the vehicle, placing the gold watch into a reinforced briefcase. His suit was rumpled, and sweat darkened the edges of his collar, but his movements remained measured and deliberate. "Almost done," Vexel said to the driver. "Seal it." The driver slammed the trunk shut. Kadion gritted his teeth. If Vexel got into that SUV, the watch and the data would disappear. "Rocco, stay on me," Kadion whispered. They advanced through the shadows along the edge of the freight cars. Kadion's fingers tightened around the crowbar as they closed the distance. The mercenaries hadn't spotted them yet. The SUV's engine idled softly, exhaust vapor curling into the cool air. Vexel stepped toward the rear passenger door. Kadion took a slow, measured breath. Then he sprinted. The mercenaries reacted with split-second reflexes. The nearest soldier swung his rifle toward Kadion. Kadion swung the crowbar like a bat, striking the barrel of the rifle. The impact jarred the weapon upward as the shot discharged harmlessly into the air. Before the soldier could recover, Kadion drove his elbow into the man's throat. The second mercenary pivoted toward Rocco. The dog lunged, jaws locking around the man's thigh. The mercenary screamed as Rocco wrenched him to the ground. Vexel turned at the commotion. His eyes met Kadion's for a heartbeat. He didn't hesitate. Vexel ducked into the SUV and slammed the door. The tires screeched as the vehicle accelerated. Kadion hurled the crowbar at the rear window. The metal bar shattered the glass, but the vehicle never slowed. "Rocco, track!" Kadion shouted. The dog took off after the fleeing SUV, muscles straining as his claws dug into the gravel. Kadion followed, breath ragged, legs burning. The SUV veered toward the south exit. Its taillights disappeared into the night. The race was far from over. The night air thickened with the acrid bite of exhaust fumes as Kadion sprinted through the rail yard, every breath a struggle against the pain gnawing at his ribs. His muscles burned with exertion, his legs heavy with fatigue, but he kept moving. Gravel crunched beneath his boots with each stride, the uneven ground threatening to twist his ankles as he pushed himself harder. Ahead, Rocco led the chase, his sleek body cutting through the shadows with effortless precision. The dog's nose locked onto the trail of sweat, adrenaline, and rubber left in the wake of Vexel's fleeing SUV. His ears twitched with heightened focus, his paws whispering against the gravel as though the ground itself carried him toward his prey. The SUV's taillights bounced and weaved ahead, the vehicle swerving wildly through the maze of abandoned shipping containers. The engine roared, gears grinding in protest as the driver fought to maintain control. Without warning, the rear tires skidded across the cracked asphalt, fishtailing toward the left. The SUV clipped the edge of a rusted crane base with a metallic screech, the impact violent enough to snap the rear axle. The vehicle jolted sideways, skidding across the lot in a cloud of sparks and dust before slamming into a dented steel container. Kadion didn't slow. The rear passenger door flew open with a creaking groan. Malric Vexel staggered out, his polished shoes slipping on the gravel. He clutched the reinforced briefcase with one hand and steadied himself against the SUV with the other. His face twisted in pain as he glanced toward the loading dock beyond the containers. The chase was over. The fight was about to begin. "Rocco," Kadion commanded, voice low and cold. "Lock in!" The dog's ears flicked in response. He accelerated, paws kicking up loose gravel. Vexel saw the movement and cursed under his breath. He turned, pushed off the SUV, and bolted toward the narrow corridor between the containers. His gait faltered slightly under the weight of the briefcase. but desperation fueled his escape. Kadion vaulted over a rusted rail, landing in a crouch. His eyes locked onto the briefcase swinging from Vexel's grip. The gold watch was inside. His grandfather's legacy, the culmination of years of brilliance reduced to a prize for a predator. Vexel disappeared into the corridor. Kadion and Rocco followed without hesitation. The corridor was narrow, hemmed in by towering containers stacked 3 high. The confined space amplified every sound. Vexel's ragged breathing, Rocco's rhythmic footfalls, the metallic rasp of gravel beneath Kadion's boots. Vexel reached the end of the passage and glanced back. His eyes widened as he saw Rocco closing the distance. He drew a compact pistol from beneath his jacket and fired blindly. The first shot sparked off the steel wall beside Kadion's head. The second ricocheted off the ground near Rocco's paws. The dog didn't flinch. "Rocco, go low," Kadion ordered. The Malinois adjusted instantly, dropping his body and accelerating into a streamlined blur of muscle and instinct. Vexel fired again, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating his pale, sweat-slicked face. Rocco launched himself forward with a feral growl. His teeth clamped around Vexel's calf, jaws crushing muscle and tendon with calibrated precision. Vexel screamed, his leg collapsing beneath him. The pistol clattered to the ground as he hit the gravel hard. Kadion slowed as he approached, crowbar raised. Rocco stood over Vexel, fangs bared, eyes locked on the fallen man. Blood darkened the dog's muzzle, staining the fur around his jaw. Vexel groaned, pushing himself into a seated position against the container wall. His chest heaved with each labored breath. The briefcase still clutched in his left hand. "You've put up a fight," Vexel rasped, voice strained. "But you're too late. The drive's already gone." Kadion planted his boot on the man's wrist and forced the briefcase from his grasp. The latches clicked open beneath his fingers. Inside, the gold watch lay nestled in black foam, pristine and untouched. Beside it, the portable drive remained connected, its LED blinking intermittently. The data hadn't transferred. "You're bluffing," Kadion said, closing the case. Vexel's lips twitched into a faint, exhausted smile. "I'm not bluffing about what happens next." His eyes shifted slightly to the left. Kadion's instincts screamed too late. The ambusher struck from the shadows behind the container. A mercenary in full tactical gear, wielding a steel baton. The weapon cracked against Kadion's shoulder, the impact sending him sprawling onto the gravel. The crowbar slipped from his grip as pain exploded through his arm. "Rocco!" Kadion gasped. The dog spun toward the new threat. The mercenary swung again. Rocco ducked beneath the blow and lunged. His jaws clamped onto the man's thigh, tearing through fabric and flesh with terrifying efficiency. Kadion rolled onto his back in time to see Vexel hauling himself upright. The man's face contorted with pain as he balanced on his uninjured leg. Kadion scrambled for the crowbar, fingers grazing the cold steel, just as Vexel drew a switchblade from his coat pocket. Vexel lunged. Kadion twisted, the knife grazing his ribs with a hot sting. He caught Vexel's wrist with both hands and yanked it downward, forcing the blade away from his torso. The two men grappled, locked in a desperate struggle for control. Vexel's breath reeked of adrenaline and desperation as he leaned close. "This ends here, Sloane," he hissed. Kadion gritted his teeth, muscles straining against the knife's edge. "No," he said. "It just starts here." The blade flicked open with a metallic snap. The gravel beneath Kadion's boots shifted as he squared up against Malric Vexel in the narrow corridor. His breath came in ragged gulps, lungs straining to pull in air that burned like acid. The cuts along his forearms throbbed with each heartbeat, and his ribs protested every movement. But he remained steady, grounded, his eyes fixed on the man across from him. Vexel leaned against the container wall, his injured leg trembling beneath him. His face was pale beneath the streaks of blood on his jaw, and his dislocated shoulder sagged unnaturally. Yet his expression betrayed no surrender, only cold, vicious resolve. The switchblade in his grip glimmered faintly, its tip dark with Kadion's blood. Rocco prowled along the perimeter, muscles coiled like a compressed spring, his amber eyes flicking between the two men. The dog's growl was a low, vibrating hum of restrained aggression. Kadion tightened his grip on the crowbar. The tactical part of his mind catalogued the environment. The uneven gravel beneath their feet, the steel walls boxing them in, the shadows stretching toward the loading dock. The corridor was narrow enough to limit lateral movement. Close-quarters combat favored aggression and adaptability. Vexel pushed away from the wall, testing his footing. He flicked the knife with a slight wrist movement, resetting his stance. The subtle shift was almost imperceptible, but Kadion recognized it immediately. "Rocco," Kadion murmured. "Passive flank. Maintain visual." The dog slinked sideways, positioning himself along Vexel's exposed left side. Vexel smiled faintly. "You always need backup?" "I don't need it," Kadion said evenly. "I use every advantage I have." Vexel lunged. He advanced with surprising speed, closing the distance in 2 strides. His knife thrust straight toward Kadion's chest, the motion efficient and deadly. Kadion pivoted sideways, deflecting the blade with his forearm. The steel edge sliced through his jacket and bit into flesh, sending a hot flash of pain up his arm. He ignored it and responded with a downward strike of the crowbar toward Vexel's collarbone. Vexel stepped inside the arc of the blow. His free hand shot up, blocking Kadion's wrist. He twisted his hips, leveraging Kadion's momentum, and drove his knee into Kadion's midsection. The impact slammed into his already bruised ribs. Kadion's vision blurred momentarily as the pain detonated through his torso. He staggered backward. Vexel pressed the advantage. He swung the knife in a horizontal slash, aimed at Kadion's throat. Kadion dropped into a crouch, the blade whistling inches above his head. He planted his left hand on the gravel, kicked his legs forward, and swept Vexel's feet out from under him. Vexel crashed to the ground with a grunt. Kadion sprang back up, gasping for air as he advanced. He swung the crowbar downward, aiming for Vexel's weapon hand. Vexel rolled to his right, evading the strike. The crowbar smashed into the gravel with a dull thud. Vexel reversed his roll and kicked upward, his heel slamming into Kadion's wrist. The crowbar flew from his grasp and clattered against the container wall. Weapon gone. Distance closed. Hand to hand now. Kadion adjusted his footing, raised his fists, and braced for the next move. Vexel stood more slowly, knife still in hand. His breathing was labored, his injured leg visibly weaker with every shift. Yet his eyes glimmered with malicious amusement. "You're good," he said, circling slightly to Kadion's left. "But you're holding back." "I'm pacing myself," Kadion said, circling to match him. "You're already running on fumes." Vexel darted forward again, knife stabbing toward Kadion's abdomen. Kadion sidestepped and parried with his left forearm, redirecting the thrust. He countered with a quick jab to Vexel's jaw. The punch landed, snapping the man's head sideways. Vexel absorbed the hit and retaliated with a diagonal slash. The blade cut a shallow line across Kadion's chest, drawing a line of fire along his skin. Kadion swore under his breath and pivoted to his right, creating half a step of distance. Vexel followed aggressively, sensing the shift in momentum. He feigned another stab toward Kadion's ribs, then redirected mid-motion, aiming lower. Kadion saw it coming a split second too late. The knife plunged into his thigh. Pain detonated through his leg. His knee buckled, and he fell backward onto the gravel. The world tilted as his peripheral vision darkened. Vexel loomed over him, lips pulled into a savage grin. He twisted the blade once, then yanked it free. Blood poured down Kadion's leg, soaking the fabric of his jeans. "Rocco!" Kadion barked through clenched teeth. "Attack! Target dominant arm!" The dog launched from his position like a missile. Vexel tried to turn, raising the knife, but Rocco hit him mid-spin. The force of the impact sent both man and dog crashing against the container wall. Rocco's jaws locked around Vexel's wrist, crushing bone with terrifying efficiency. The knife dropped. Vexel screamed, trying to pry the dog's jaws from his arm with his free hand. Rocco growled, his teeth grinding into flesh. "Rocco! Release! Return!" The dog instantly obeyed, unclenching his jaws and retreating to Kadion's side. Kadion forced himself to stand. His injured leg wobbled beneath him, but he shifted his weight onto his good leg and advanced. Vexel cradled his mangled wrist, his breath shallow and panicked. Blood dripped from his arm, splattering against his shoes. Kadion stepped in and delivered a front kick to Vexel's chest. The impact sent the man sprawling against the container wall. Vexel slumped, but didn't fall. His eyes darted wildly around the corridor, searching for a weapon or an escape route. There was none. Kadion closed the distance, grabbing the front of Vexel's shirt. He slammed him against the steel surface with brutal force. The man's head cracked against the metal. "Game over," Kadion growled, voice low and dangerous. Vexel coughed, blood trickling from his nose. "You think you win by keeping the watch? The plans are bigger than you, bigger than your grandfather's genius. Someone else will come for it." "Maybe," Kadion said, leaning in close. "But you won't." He drove his knee into Vexel's stomach. The man doubled over, gasping for breath. Kadion spun him around and forced his arms behind his back. He retrieved a zip tie from his jacket pocket and cinched it around Vexel's wrists, pulling the plastic restraint tight until it cut into skin. Vexel groaned, his strength finally depleted. Kadion pushed him to his knees and stepped back, chest heaving. Rocco padded forward and sat beside him, still tense, but no longer growling. The fight was done. The briefcase remained untouched behind them, its contents secure. Kadion wiped his bloody hands on his jeans and limped toward the case. He knelt, opened it, and ran his fingers over the cool metallic surface of the gold watch. The intricate engravings reflected the dim light, the mechanism still ticking softly, as if unaware of the war waged around it. He closed the case with a satisfying click. Behind him, Vexel coughed. "It's just the beginning," he rasped. "This fight won't stop." Kadion stood and turned, eyes cold. "You're right. I won't stop until it's finished. Power always finds a new hand. Not this time." Kadion gave Rocco a subtle hand signal. The dog moved to Vexel's side, sat, and fixed his gaze on the defeated man's face. The message was clear. Kadion inhaled slowly, fighting the weight of exhaustion. The sirens in the distance grew louder, accompanied by faint, flashing lights reflecting off the containers. "Let's wrap this up," Kadion muttered to Rocco. "We did the hard part." The dog stood, wagging his tail once in acknowledgement. Kadion turned his back on Vexel and limped toward the loading dock with Rocco by his side. The battle was over, but the war for his grandfather's legacy had only begun. The cold steel of the briefcase pressed against Kadion's palms as he knelt beside it, chest heaving from the brutal fight. The air around him was thick with the lingering metallic tang of blood and the acrid residue of spent gunpowder. His vision swam with exhaustion, but he forced himself to stay sharp. He unlatched the case with a quiet click, lifting the lid to reveal the gold pocket watch resting in its foam cradle. The polished brass casing gleamed beneath the dim floodlights, intricate engravings spiraling across its surface with deceptive elegance. He ran a finger over the familiar initials etched into the back. C.S. Caleb Sloan. His grandfather's legacy. His family's burden. Kadion's thumb pressed the crown, releasing the watch face. Beneath the ornate clockwork gears lay the hidden component that had driven this entire war. A micro-etched code set into the secondary plate. The digits appeared random to the untrained eye, but Kadion understood now. This wasn't a patent number or a bank account access. It was the encryption key to a digital lock built decades ahead of its time. The wireless energy transmission patent, the very concept his grandfather had pioneered, wasn't lost. It had been locked away, protected from corporate predators like Malric Vexel. The watch didn't store the patent itself. Instead, it held the cryptographic signature required to access the secure vault Caleb Sloan had hidden through layers of legal and digital obfuscation. The gang had thought they were stealing an antique. Vexel had known better. "Smart old man," Kadion muttered, feeling the weight of the revelation. The rhythmic thud of Rocco's paws broke his concentration. The dog padded to his side, lowering his head to sniff the briefcase. Blood still darkened the fur around Rocco's muzzle, his chest rising and falling with steady, measured breaths. "Good job, partner," Kadion said, scratching behind the dog's ear. Rocco licked his chops and sat, ears swiveling toward the faint sound of approaching sirens. The familiar warble of emergency vehicles grew louder with each passing second. Flashing blue lights appeared beyond the far end of the rail yard, bouncing off the rusted metal surfaces. "Police inbound," Kadion murmured, more to himself than anyone else. He closed the briefcase and stood, wincing as the deep cut in his thigh flared with renewed intensity. He shifted his weight to his good leg and scanned the area. Vexel lay face down in the gravel where Kadion had left him, wrists secured with a zip tie. His breathing was shallow but consistent. The man's shattered wrist and dislocated shoulder were the least of his concerns now. Behind Vexel, the bodies of his mercenaries were strewn across the loading dock like discarded chess pieces. Some groaned, trying to push themselves upright. Others lay still, unconscious or worse. Rocco stiffened, ears perking as the sirens reached their peak. "Stay close," Kadion said. The first patrol car screeched to a halt near the chain-link gate. Officers spilled out, weapons raised as they fanned into a tactical formation. Their movements were sharp, but lacked the polish of true combat veterans. "Hands where we can see them," one officer shouted, his flashlight beam cutting through the haze. Kadion raised his hands, keeping the briefcase gripped in his left. Rocco sat at his side, ears erect but posture relaxed, just as Kadion had trained him for high-stress encounters. "Former Navy SEAL," Kadion called, voice steady despite his exhaustion. "I'm unarmed. The gang you're looking for is down." He tilted his head toward Vexel. "Gang leader on the ground. Name's Malric Vexel." The officers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. "Approach slowly," Kadion advised. "He's dangerous, even restrained." The lead officer motioned to two subordinates, who advanced cautiously toward Vexel. One of them nudged the man with his boot. Vexel groaned, but didn't move. They secured his legs and hauled him upright. "Vexel's been on Interpol's watch list," the lead officer muttered, glancing at Kadion. "What's his game? Corporate sabotage, illegal arms funding. And this time?" Kadion lifted the briefcase slightly. "He was after my grandfather's patent, wireless energy transmission technology. With this, he could have auctioned off the future of global power to the highest bidder." The officer's eyes widened. "That's big." "Yeah," Kadion said, "and it nearly slipped through our fingers." The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of flashing lights, radio chatter, and the metallic clink of handcuffs. Rocco stayed by Kadion's side throughout, only moving when paramedics approached to inspect Kadion's leg. The medics wrapped the wound with compression gauze and advised immediate medical attention. The officers corralled the surviving mercenaries into patrol cars. Each man was cuffed, searched, and logged before being driven away. The bodies of the deceased were covered with tarps, marking the deadly stakes of the night's events. Vexel, barely conscious, was dragged into the back of an armored transport vehicle. His face was slack with defeat, his mouth slightly open, as though still processing his failure. As the officers secured his seatbelt, he lifted his head and locked eyes with Kadion through the open door. The faintest smile tugged at Vexel's lips. Kadion's stomach tightened. The man's eyes held no regret, only a cold, unyielding sense of unfinished business. The officers slammed the door shut, breaking the stare. The transport's engine rumbled to life, and the vehicle rolled away into the night. By the time the officers finished their preliminary reports, dawn had crested the horizon. The sky glowed with muted orange and purple hues, casting long shadows across the rail yard. Kadian sat on the open tailgate of an ambulance, Rocco resting beside him with his head on Kadian's boot. Detective Clara Nguyen approached, notebook in hand. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, and her eyes were sharp beneath the brim of her department-issued cap. "SEAL skills came in handy tonight," she said, flipping a page. "The whole operation looks like something out of a movie." "Didn't feel like one," Kadian replied, adjusting the ice pack strapped to his thigh. "You know," she said, glancing at the briefcase beside him, "that patent of yours? If it's as revolutionary as you claim, you're going to attract more vultures like Vexel." Kadian nodded. "Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out." "Any plans?" "Secure the patent," Kadian said. "Figure out what my grandfather was protecting, and make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands again." Nguyen closed her notebook. "Good luck with that." She extended a card. "Call me if you need help, or if another gang of lunatics shows up." Kadian accepted the card with a nod. The detective walked away, leaving Kadian alone with Rocco. He opened the briefcase again. The watch gleamed softly in the morning light. The patent code engraved inside represented not just his grandfather's brilliance, but a responsibility he hadn't asked for and couldn't ignore. Rocco lifted his head, sniffing the air as though sensing the gravity of the moment. "Looks like we've got more work to do, buddy," Kadian said, stroking the dog's neck. Rocco gave a soft huff, tail thumping lightly against the metal tailgate. Kadian shut the briefcase, rose to his feet with a wince, and limped toward the exit, with Rocco by his side. The next morning, Kadian loaded Rocco into the truck and drove out to the countryside, where a vast, open field stretched beneath a pale blue sky. The Belgian Malinois sat upright in the passenger seat, ears pricked and eyes alert, as they passed rows of wind-tossed grass swaying in the breeze. The sharp scent of pine drifted through the open window, and Rocco sniffed the air, his nose twitching with interest. When Kadian parked beside the field, he opened the door, and Rocco hopped down, trotting toward the fence line. The dog paused, surveying the open space with a soldier's instinct, his eyes sweeping the landscape for movement. Kadian followed and leaned against the wooden fence, watching his companion. "You earned this, buddy," Kadian said, scratching behind Rocco's ears as the dog returned to his side. "No more gang wars. No more chasing lunatics through warehouses. Just us, a quiet life, and maybe some squirrels to keep you sharp." Rocco tilted his head at the word squirrels and gave a low, expectant huff. "Yeah, I know," Kadian said with a chuckle. "Squirrels don't stand a chance." The dog wagged his tail and trotted a few steps forward, then looked back, waiting. "Go on, stretch your legs," Kadian said, motioning toward the field. Rocco took off in a blur of muscle and precision, his paws kicking up soft tufts of grass as he sprinted through the open space. Kadian watched him go, feeling a rare sense of peace settle over his chest. This dog had saved his life more times than he could count, tracking the thieves after the break-in, taking down mercenaries during the auction ambush, and sinking his teeth into Vexel's wrist at a moment when everything teetered on the edge of disaster. Now, Rocco deserved a break. But retirement? No, Rocco wasn't just a working dog. He was family. When the dog circled back, panting and bright-eyed from his impromptu run, Kadian crouched beside him and ran his fingers through the thick fur along his shoulders. "We've done enough, buddy," Kadian said softly. "The patent's safe. Nevier's future's set. Now it's just us. No more wars. Just life." Rocco's tail thumped against the grass. He leaned into Kadian's hand, giving a low, approving rumble. "Yeah, that's what I thought," Kadian said, standing with a grunt. "Come on, partner, let's go home." They climbed back into the truck, the old leather seats groaning beneath their weight. Kadian turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life. Rocco settled beside him, head on his paws but eyes still alert, watching the road ahead. That night, they returned to the workshop. The building smelled of oil and metal, the same familiar scents Kadian had grown up with. He placed the briefcase back on the workbench, running his fingers along the worn wood etched with decades of scratches and marks. The gold watch was gone now, passed along with the patent to its new custodians. Caleb Sloan's vision would live on, powering villages, hospitals, and communities once forgotten by modern infrastructure. Nevi's future was secured. The Iron Hounds were dismantled. Vexel was locked away. And Daz? He was out there, finally trying to stand on his own. Cadion dropped into the old chair beside the workbench, exhaling as the weight of the journey slowly released its grip on him. Rocco settled at his feet, resting his head on his paws. The dog gave a soft sigh, his tail thumping once in contentment. The war for the patent was over. The inheritance wasn't the technology, it was the responsibility that came with it. Cadion closed his eyes and let the weight of it finally ease. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.